To indie publish or traditional publish? That is the question. All right, enough pseudo-Shakespeare. A decade ago, independent publishing was seen as Plan B, the consolation prize for authors who weren't good enough to get a contract. Back then, the only authors who self-published were those who couldn't break it into the traditional publishing world. Indie publishing carried a stigma. It was for the, quote, second-class, unquote, authors. The sad, lonely, the dejected. But times have changed, and the stigma has changed as well. This is due to, in part, because many independent authors outsell and out-earn the status-chasing traditional authors. Today, many authors actively choose independent publishing for their books, even when they have a contract from big-name publishers. And while it is common for traditional authors to give up on traditional publishing and go independent, it is far less common for successful indies to sign with a major publisher. But why? Why would anyone make indie publishing their plan A? We'll find out in this episode of Novel Marketing, the longest-running book marketing podcast in the world. And we have a guest on the show today who's an author, a conference speaker, and the father of 10, Scott LaPierre. Welcome to the Novel Marketing Podcast.
Glad to be here, Thomas. Thanks so much for having me on the show. Been a longtime fan.
So tell us your publishing journey. How did you get into writing books?
I've been a pastor. I didn't ever seek out to be an author. I decided to preach on marriage at our church for a season. It was supposed to be the marriage month, and the long-running joke is that it became the marriage year. And so my wife told me that really needed to be my first book, this book on marriage, because I'd put all these sermons together. I was getting good feedback from the congregation. So we go away on vacation as a family, and that's when I put this book together. I have no idea. So it's like 140,000 words. Needs to be down to about 60, 70,000 words, obviously, for a reasonable nonfiction book. And I'm so naive that when I have this manuscript together, I'm kind of going to the Thomas Nelson website to see where I upload this to get them to publish it for me. And that's my, so then that's my dive into literary agents and query letters and everything associated with that I had no familiarity with. And that you don't really strive to get a publisher. I mean, if you kind of classify publishers as small, medium, and large, you can probably get a smaller, medium-sized one without an agent. But I wasn't really interested in that. And so I'm putting together query letters, sending them out, and I probably sent out 40 of them or something. Me and B got 1 or 2 responses. And this one gentleman writes me, and he said, there's no way that anyone's going to be interested in you, which is kind of shocking and hurtful at first, but was very good counsel to receive, because then I'm no longer going to continue beating my head against the wall, right? And I wrote him back and I said, hey, obviously that's not what I wanted to hear, but can you elaborate? And he said, well, you don't have, and there's just no better word to use, as much as I dislike it, but platform. So then that's my introduction to a platform. He said, you ought to just take your book and self-publish it. And so then I started self-publishing, kind of forced to do it, you might say. And I enjoyed it. And the sales were pretty good.
And by pretty good, what are we looking at? What were your initial
sales?
sales?
That's a good question, Thomas. So you told me I could disagree with you. And one of the things you've said regularly throughout your show is not to publish your first book. Well, I might be the exception, because I published my first book, Your Marriage God's Way, and it did incredibly well, which I didn't know at the time was incredibly well until I published other books and saw that those sales didn't compare with my first book. So that was kind of my introduction. The first book went well, seemed to sell well, and it had 25,000 copies, which I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but it's part of what I think caught Harvest House's attention. So I'm self-publishing at this time. My marriage book is getting me some speaking engagements. I mean, even though I'm a full-time pastor, my elders have graciously given me about 6 to 8 weekends per year to travel out in the country to do marriage conferences, which I love doing. I published an accompanying workbook. Then this other author talks to me one day, and by this time I'm completely comfortable with pretty much every aspect of self-publishing. And he says, you got a lot of good things going for you. Have you ever thought about having a literary agent? And I said, yeah, of course. Years ago, I tried to get one. And just as you said incredibly well at the beginning of the show, that's kind of the litmus test for success as an author, is when you get a publisher. And I wanted that traditional route as much for validation as anything else, and just to feel like I'd really made it as an author. And so he says, well, I've got this literary agent, and I think you got a lot of good stuff going for you, and I'd like to introduce you to her. And I said, well, I'm not really pursuing that route anymore, because I've become pretty comfortable self-publishing, but didn't see any harm in it. And she said, I think we could get you a good contract. When they see your sales and they see how you've done as an indie author, then when they can get kind of behind what you're doing, it's going to be even bigger and better. So, of course, that sounded great to me. And so we put together a proposal, super lengthy process. She does a great job with that, pitches out my proposal to all these different publishers. And this was for a finance book. So my brand is God's Way. It's Your Marriage God's Way, Your Finances God's Way. Being Content God's Way is my next book that's coming out. I had the book pretty well finished, but I'm going to see what it's like to go through a traditional publisher if someone's interested in me. And so then one of the executives with Harvest House, he says, hey, why don't you come down to Portland and we'll have breakfast together. I saw your proposal and I'm pretty interested in what you're doing. And so I head down there with my wife and I meet with him and his wife and we have breakfast and I give him copies of my books and he seems very enthusiastic about me and what I'm doing. But he said something in that meeting that I just did not take seriously enough. And I might even camp on this a bit if you're interested, Thomas, because I think it's a really important thing for your listeners to know. He said, we're not going to be able to do much for you that you're not already doing. We're not going to be able to offer anything to you that you don't already have. And I just blew that off because I'm so excited about getting published with. And that's not even a reflection of Harvest House. This is largely the case for most publishers. And so I don't have anything bad. I'm buying my books back from Harvest House. And just to be clear, they're a great publisher. I only have good things to say about them. So what he meant by that was, I think there's this wrong belief that a traditional publisher is going to give you marketing and they're going to do a ton of work for your book. And that's just not true. The way it kind of used to work was like the golden light shines down on an author and that publisher chooses that author. And then that publisher gets behind that author, gives them a platform, makes them huge and sells all their books for them. Well, now it's pretty much the opposite. Publishers are looking for authors who already are established and have platforms. So in this super ironic twist, publishers are basically looking for authors who don't need publishers. Publishers are looking for authors who are already established and selling their books. What is it that a publisher can provide? Well, a publisher can provide your cover. They can provide an editor. They can provide the interior, the typesetting. And for all your listeners, they know that I just listed all the things that you can secure very easily.
To your point about they want people who don't want to work with them, really business savvy authors who have big platforms don't work with traditional publishers. Dave Ramsey publishes his own books. Taylor Swift publishes her own books, right? She's like, what would a publisher do for me other than taking most of the money? I don't need the publisher in any way. And so she completely went around the publisher and made a ton of money. The same way she went around the major movie studios to get her show directly in AMC theaters. She just contracted directly with AMC. And for her book, she contracted directly with Target. And that's the kind of thing that I think terrifies publishers, because publishers would have made millions of dollars off of Taylor Swift, but she kept all those $1 million for her because those private jets aren't going to fly themselves. They're expensive to operate. She needs to keep all the royalties for herself if she wants to keep her big empire running.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and so there's a whole other conversation we could have at some point about marketing and cost per click and what your cost per click can be when you're going to make $4 per book. But as soon as you're going to make 80 cents per book, then your cost per click you're not going to get any clicks.
And that 80 cents is not like Harvest House giving Scott a bad deal. That's like the standard. It's between 80 cents and $1 per book is what a traditionally published author makes. And that's only after they sell through their advance. So for the first several thousand books, they don't actually get any money from the publisher. And when they do get the money, they get it after 6 months. Whereas indie authors tend to make around $4, let's say $4 to $8, depending on various factors, per copy. And they get paid between 30 and 60 days after the sale happens. So it's a much faster cash flow cycle if you're paying for ads, and it's a much higher cost per reader, which is also helpful if you're paying for ads. Were you buying ads for your book? Was advertising a part of your marketing mix?
Yeah, absolutely. I use Amazon ads. I tried Facebook ads. I've tried Twitter ads, Google, but Amazon works well for me. And I understand that someone makes it big with Facebook ads. This kind of happened years ago. And then everyone throws themselves into Facebook ads. And I don't know if it was, just too populated, but I can do well with that. And I've done well with Amazon ads. I've really enjoyed them. And I almost think, to be honest, Thomas, that might have been kind of what happened was Harvest House looked at me and they're like, wow, this guy has all these sales. He must be this. And I don't have a large platform. I'm guessing most of your listeners haven't heard from me, probably haven't been to my conference. I'm not a big name person, right? I'm not John MacArthur, and so I'm not Paul Washer. I sell most of my books through my marketing effort, not through my name. And so when you take away my marketing, which is essentially what happens when I sign with Harvest House, then my sales are lost. Something pretty interesting that happened, because I'm guessing most of your authors you've interviewed didn't experience this, is a pretty unique situation. The Harvest House wanted to sign me to a multi-book deal, but they wanted to republish my book, Your Marriage, God's Way. They had seen the sales from it, and I don't think they were trying to take advantage of me. I thought that they thought this was going to be a great way to launch me out into the publishing world. But the problem, Thomas, is that meant pulling it off Amazon. All of Amazon's algorithms that had already been working hard to sell my book, which is a whole other conversation, that you can get Amazon to work for you. You can get its algorithms to kick in and sell your book for you. It was a painful thing, but I take Your Marriage, God's Way off of Amazon, the book and the workbook. Harvest House publishes it, and I'm kind of sitting there with anticipation, excited. My wife and I can't wait to see what happens, and it just seemed like it went flat, and it kind of felt dead in the water, you might say. Sales aren't coming in. Now, to be honest, the sales did come in, like you just mentioned, that you want to sell out your advance. I did sell out my advance. Harvest House told me they were going to do another printing, but I don't think that it was as many sales as I was having before. And so while they were kind of, I don't know if I'd say enthusiastic about the sales, I wasn't that enthusiastic. And obviously I didn't have more money after.
So how many copies per month were you selling before you signed with Harvest House?
Probably 500 to 600.
Okay. And how many copies were you selling with Harvest House after the initial launch? What was
Probably 200 or 300.
Okay. So you had a successful indie book that you were buying ads for, and you had an engine where you were going out and you were buying readers. Let's say you're buying them for $2 a reader, and you're making $4 a reader off of them. Is that kind of close to the math, kind of, sort of?
And maybe a simpler way to say it, Thomas, would be my cost per click was about 50 cents on Amazon. And I could be profitable, as you ratchet up your cost per click and determine levels of profitability for you. For me, I knew that I could run ads for about 50 cents per click. That doesn't mean a click is a sale. A click is a click, right? But those convert to enough sales that I'm still profitable. Well, as soon as I'm running ads and I'm making 80 cents per book, and I put my cost per click down to, what is that going to be, 15 cents? You don't even get any clicks. So that was one of the problems.
And this is another thing that a lot of authors don't realize, is that traditional publishers aren't going to pay for advertising for your book. And you can tell this because they never promise to in their contract, right? They very easily could commit to spending $10,000 on Amazon ads to promote your book, but they'll never do that because they don't want to spend that money. They want to get the sales for free, or they want you to pay for the ads. They want you ideally to spend all your 80 cents that you're going to make in your royalty to buy clicks for them. I remember being on a call with a major publisher back when I was a literary agent, and the marketing person was trying to convince the author to spend basically her entire advance on a book trailer. And I knew that book trailers didn't drive sales. Right? There's a reason Amazon does not allow authors to embed them on books, because they actually hurt sales. A low-budget video from a reader is far more effective than a book trailer, and they were wanting to get this really expensive one, and I was like, don't do that, because now you're working completely for free for the publishing house, where you don't get a single penny from them, right? They gave you some money and they're asking you to give it right back to them, and it's pretty abusive, actually. And it's one of the services that literary agents do, is that they protect authors from getting beat up too much by their traditional publishers. But I really want to underline here, your sales went down when you went with the traditional publisher. A lot of authors think the sales are going to go up. But if you have advertising working for you, and if you're using the indie marketing techniques, a lot of which we talk about on this podcast, you can't use those, many of them, as a traditionally published author. You don't have the margins, so you're making too little a book to be able to afford most of the marketing techniques. And this is what's happened, is that traditionally published authors have become kind of the poor in the publishing world, because they just don't have any money and they don't have any budget. But it's not just about the money, it's also about the cash flow. Because even if you could do it profitably, paying money now to get it back in 6 months means that you have to have 6 months of working capital in order to operate. That is a lot of working capital. Anybody who's been in business school or studied business and knows cash flow knows that's a terrible cash flow cycle. Ideally, you want a positive cash flow cycle. So Amazon makes money now, and then they pay their vendors 30 days from now. So they've been able to grow their whole empire off of a positive cash flow cycle, where they effectively borrow money from their own vendors for 30 days. working it the other way for 6 months is just crushing. But it's not just about the money. It's not just about the cash flow. The other big problem is data. So as an indie author, you had this wonderful KDP dashboard. You could know exactly how many sales you got today, how many sales you got yesterday. If you're using Amazon tags, you could know how many of those sales came from Facebook, how many of those sales came from your X advertising campaign, how many of them came from your Amazon clicks, how many just came organically because people were searching for you. And you could do experiments and you could learn. And as soon as you signed with Harvest House, they put a blindfold on you and you didn't get any of that data.
Right. There's an author dashboard and you can see kind of rankings and things, but it pales in comparison to the data you can get as an indie author. And one of the things I'd say, Thomas, is publishers can do something that authors think is really great, but it's not that great, and that's get books in bookstores. So publishers are good at getting books in brick and mortar bookstores. And this might sound harsh or it might even sound arrogant. I don't think publishers understand Amazon as well as many indie authors do. And here's what I mean by that. Amazon is not a bookstore. Amazon's a search engine. Behind Google, it's tied with YouTube for being the second largest one. If you can approach Amazon and understand that it's a search engine and you're going to optimize your books for Amazon, you're going to increase your sales dramatically. I was talking to people in the publishing world who didn't know SEO, who didn't know keywords, who didn't know about embedding keywords in book descriptions, who didn't, and I mean, I'm like pulling my hair out and I don't have any control over this. I can't change my descriptions. Even my book cover, I have a very conservative marriage book. The cover they provided is this gorgeous looking cover, but it's a super contemporary one. It did not resonate with my readers, and I don't have a whole lot of control over that. And suddenly all of my branding has changed. I've got this branding that's going one direction, and then it goes this other direction. And I kind of looked at the book description on Amazon when it was first published, and I'm trying to find what would be keywords there that would help with search optimization, and I don't even think that it was there. I'm not sure that that was really on their minds. And so that's one of the issues too, is that indie authors have become incredibly familiar with this side of marketing, but it's not one that I think publishers have as much familiarity with.
That's been my exact same experience interacting with executives at publishing companies, is that a lot of them either come from the editorial world, where they were some sort of English major and then they were an editor and then they rose up the ranks through the editorial world and kind of had to learn business on the job, or they came up through the retail world. They ran a bookstore, they worked at a warehouse, and they understand fulfillment and inventory costs and things that are really important. And in the paper world, that's really important to understand inventory costs and warehousing and distribution and efficiencies there can really give you an edge, especially for evergreen books where the demand is pretty steady. Let's say you're selling Bibles, for instance, right? You don't have to do a lot of marketing for a Bible. The popularity of one translation doesn't change too much year to year, right? You measure these things in decades. And so having really good distribution experience is really helpful there. And what they tend to not have are people who came up through the SEO search engine world, who understand metadata really well, who understand algorithms really well, keywords, how to reverse engineer an algorithm, right? Because they're like, well, Amazon doesn't share the algorithm, therefore it's impossible to optimize for it. It's like, that's false. It's like they don't share the algorithm, which means that by figuring it out yourself, by running your own experiments, you can get insights into the algorithm that maybe no other publisher has. And this is what you see a lot in the indie world, where indies are very close to their readers. They know exactly what their readers want, and it allows them to have highly efficient algorithm optimization, and they are able to really help the algorithm find them their kind of reader. And you see this not just in nonfiction. In fact, I would say it's more rare in nonfiction than it is in the fiction world. And the indie novelists have this really tuned in. So that if you're a lit RPG author, you know exactly who your reader is, and you know exactly how to help the algorithm find the right kind of nerd who's into your kind of lit RPG and not that other kind of lit RPG that they don't like.
So it's a pretty discouraging thing, to kind of have what you think is going to be your dream come true and then find out that it doesn't go that way. And so then my wife and I begin this conversation of like, boy, I really miss having my own book. I miss having control over it. The other thing is, as much as you might like a publisher, they're not going to care about your book as much as you do. And so there are things that you can do, changes you can make through the KDP dashboard incredibly easily. But to get those same changes made through your publisher is very difficult. If you find a mistake on a page, you find something that you wish was different, you can send your list to your publisher, but that's not going to be changed until the next printing, because they print out like 5,000 copies of that book at a time. And it's not going to be until the next printing that you get to see those changes in that. And the other thing is even just author copies. Harvest House says, hey, we're going to offer you all these discounts. You're going to get your book at this discounted price, which is very important to me because as a speaker, there's a few $1,000 you hope to make, not from the honorarium, but from the book sales at the event. And when you buy your book through KDP and you get it for $3, $4 a book, and then you have to buy it through your publisher for $7 or $8 per book, then that really cuts down on your margins. The other thing is I had to buy, and I'm not kidding, thousands of copies of my book from Harvest House to get the discounted prices. And so then you've got a storage issue. I mean, do you have a huge area of your garage where you can put thousands of books and then you're trying to sell through them? Whereas through KDP, you're ordering just a few, however many author copies. I can even send them to the event. I can go into my dashboard. I know that I'm speaking in North Carolina or Florida, and I just mail the books to the church and I say, hey, hold on to these until I get there, and I don't even have to transport them. So there's a lot of things that are logistically easier as well as an indie author, I think. So I'm talking to my wife and just saying, I can't believe this, but I regret this. I wish I could get my book back. And again, not a reflection of Harvest House. And I kind of knew, Thomas, that if I went down this road of getting my book back, I was going to be burning some bridges, kind of with the whole traditional publishing world. And I think that's one thing that I would tell your authors. I know I'm in a bit of a unique situation because most people are like entirely indie or entirely traditional, and I've been able to experience both of them. And I'll tell your authors that if they go that traditional route and then they want to get the rights back to their books, it's going to be very difficult for them to get a traditional publisher again, and their literary agent might not even want to keep working with them. And so, that first time that I said, hey, you're great. This isn't personal. Harvest House is great, but it's become pretty evident to me that I'm an indie author. I knew that probably meant the end of my relationship. I mean, we might be friends on Facebook, or she might congratulate me if we're having a child, or if I see something going on with her kid, but we don't have much of a professional relationship. She doesn't represent me as an agent any longer, is what I would say. And the same with probably any other publisher. If I was to reach out to them, I'm not sure that they'd be interested if they knew that I got my rights back. I haven't tried it, so I can't say how other publishers would respond, but it's important to know that once you try to buy your books back, get the rights back, you're probably burning your bridges with that traditional publishing world.
And let's talk about that, because you didn't demand that you get the rights back. You basically entered into a contract and be like, how much will it cost me to buy back the rights of my book? And a lot of authors don't realize that this is an option. It's almost always on the table. The price may be higher than you want to pay, but almost never. And here's why. Most medium-sized to large publishers are publishing at least 52 books a year. And many of them are publishing hundreds of books a year, which means every week there's some new darling that they're excited about. And your book from last week or last month or last year is no longer the new darling. Like, indie authors will go in and they're constantly fiddling and optimizing. It's part of the reason why they're able to win on SEO, because they don't just create the Amazon page one time, they're constantly improving it. And so over time, that page gets more and more effective. It ranks better and better. Whereas traditional publishers are thinking more of like, this is a print book. Once it's done, it's done. Once we get it out, we get it out. And they're not going back as often and fiddling with metadata and fiddling with keyword optimization, things like that, with the exception of perhaps their very top tier of books that are performing really well. And if you come to them and say, hey, I will buy all of the copies that are in your warehouse, what's the price that we need to do that? They're like, wow, we don't have to warehouse this. All of our costs go away. Then you can negotiate and see if you can find a price that was reasonable for both of you. So walk us through that process of approaching Harvest House and saying, I want to buy my book back from you.
Yeah, that's a good question, Thomas. And I don't want to assume anything because that people would know about that, because I didn't know about it. It's kind of like when I go to the Thomas Nelson website and how am I going to get them to publish my book for me? Now it's like, okay, now how do I get my books back? I didn't even know, can I get my books back? I signed stuff. I'm going back, I'm revisiting my contracts. I have contracts for each of the 4 books with Harvest House, and I'm trying to look at that fine print and see, and it's like, okay, here's conversations about rights reversions. And I'm initially having this conversation, and to her credit, she probably wasn't a super comfortable conversation with her, but she did help me through that. And so I reach out to them, and you're right. If you have an advance, if they give you $15,000 or $20,000 for a book, then they're going to expect you to pay back that advance if you haven't already paid it off through sales, and they're going to expect you to buy back the inventory. Now, the way that it worked for me, because Your Marriage God's Way did do well, I think, for Harvest House. I had sold through the initial printing, and I had paid off my advance, and I had actually started getting royalties for maybe like about 2 years. I think it was about 2 years before the book paid itself off. And so when I reached out to them about that, they said, hey, this is where things are at. And they were gracious and giving it back. Now, my next book, Your Finances God's Way, that was the one that was challenging because there was an amount of the advance that was left and there was inventory on hand. They ran some discounts themselves to get rid of some of the inventory for it, which is a real blessing to me because then they don't have all this on hand. And if they don't do that, I don't know what other publishers do. But Harvest House, because they ran these discounts and unloaded like 1,000 copies to some distributor that got them at like 50% off or something. So now their inventory is shrinking, less for me to buy back. It's also burning through some of my advance. And so I think there's about like $700 or something to pay Harvest House to get Your Finances God's Way, the workbook back. I already got the book back. And in fact, we're having this conversation, but Your Finances God's Way was just published by me on Amazon this morning or yesterday. But again, these are all things that authors can do on their own without a publisher. And sometimes you'll take more care of your work. You'll be more interested in it than a publisher will. You can secure, there's really great cover designers, editors, interior layout people out there that can do these things as well as a publisher can do them for you. And then you'll keep more of your royalties.
And often it's the exact same people. So many cover designers aren't on staff with publishing houses. With the exception of some children's book houses, most cover designers work freelance. And the publishing house will hire a cover designer based off of if they think this particular designer is a fit for this particular book. And if you talk with professional cover designers, they'll often list dozens of publishing houses that they do covers for because they tend to do a certain kind of book or for a certain kind of audience. And those cover designers are often very hireable by indies. In fact, it's not uncommon for them to do as much work for successful indie authors as they do for big publishing houses. Now, they're more expensive than going with a cheap pre-made cover with a cover designer who's just getting started, but you can have the exact same levels of quality on your own from the exact same people, because the same is true with editors. Editors are a little bit more likely to be on staff with publishers, I would say, than working freelance, but a lot of editors also are freelance where they work both for publishing houses and for successful indies. And so if you're willing to pay a little bit more, you can get the exact same level of editing. So the barrier in terms of quality is not there. You can match that quality, and in terms of your marketing, you can exceed it, where the indies have much more optimized marketing and are making a lot more money per copy.
And let me just piggyback on that, Thomas, because people might be wondering, well, how am I supposed to find these editors? How am I supposed to find these cover designers or interior people? You can go to the copyright page, and many of them are listed there for you. And so I'm not joking, but here's what I did. I liked the way my book looked, the interior. And I went to the copyright page, and it said who did the interior for my book right there. I reached out to that agency, and I said, hey, I got kind of an interesting situation here. My name's Scott LaPierre. You did the interior for my book for Harvest House. I liked it so much that I bought the book back from Harvest House, and I'm interested in you doing it for me. So if you pick up a book and you say, I really like the way this cover looks, I like the way this interior looks, how do I find the designer? Then just go to the copyright page, and often the publisher will have the designer listed there. Go do a little search on the internet. You can contact them and then just mention the book name and say, hey, here, there's this book. I saw that you did the interior for it or the cover. I thought it looked really good. Can you let me know what it would cost to secure your services for you to do the same thing for me? I've been using Mibel Art for cover design. They do a really great job. There's an editor who's another author, Doug Bond, that I've worked with for years, and I think that these services are as high quality as a publisher.
And you can also find names in the acknowledgments. I'm a big believer that if you're indie publishing, you should put the names of every single person you paid in the book, either in an acknowledgments on the copyright page. On my book, I have a credits page because I wanted to make it really clear. And I would put this as part of the negotiation. Be like, hey, I want to put your name in the book. I'll even list your website in the credits page. So, if people really like the work that you do, they may bring you more work. And this is a technique I learned from Steve Jobs. He believed that people do better work when their names are on it. So on the very first Apple II computers, they actually had, I think, laser etched the signatures of all of the engineers that worked on the Apple II. somewhere inside the chassis. And these computers are now incredibly valuable collector's items. But Steve did that on purpose, right? It cost him money to laser etch, to capture the signatures and laser etch them into the computer, but it was worth it for him because he knew those engineers were going to be more likely to work late, more likely to work hard if they knew their name was on it. And I saw this. One of the people who was working on my book was in the middle of a cross-country move, and we were like needing some last minute changes from her, and she knew that her name was in the book, and she didn't want to, for her part that she was getting credit for, to not be done right. And so in the middle of her move, she was getting back to us and being responsive, and she would have been very happy for us to go with someone else because she was in the middle of the move and to miss out on the money. But because her name was already in the book, she was committed now to quality and to speed. And so give credit. It helps their business, it helps the ecosystem, but it also gives you a better book in the end.
It makes them invested in the project and in the success and excellence of it. Yeah, that's a great point.
So this process that you're going through of starting off indie and then going traditional and then switching back to indie has actually become very common in the romance space as well for a lot of the very exact same reasons. And there's starting to emerge a new kind of publishing company designed for savvy indies. And there's one of these in the romance space, and I'm starting to see kind of the seeds of these in other genres. Because what a indie is wanting from a publisher is very different from what a traditional author wants from a publisher. Most traditional authors don't know what typesetting is. They don't know how to do it. It's very mysterious for them. They don't realize how easy it can be. Right? Like if you're writing a novel, you just put your book in vellum and it does it sometimes in just 5 minutes. It's not a complicated process, but because they don't know, the mystery of it scares them. And so they want somebody else to handle it for them. Whereas a savvy indie, they know how to typeset, they know how to get a good cover. And by good, I mean the kind of cover that works at attracting their kind of reader. They don't care about the advance. So typical traditional authors don't want a really big advance. This is the main thing that publishers compete on, and publishers are almost a cartel in that the royalties they give are pretty standard across the board. So it's really difficult to negotiate on the royalty, whereas an indie author really wants a large royalty that frees them up for the kind of advertising that they want to do, and they don't care as much about the advance. What successful indies want from a publisher is distribution into bookstores, and that's it. I want you to give me a sales team to knock on doors at bookstores so that they're placing orders, and I want you to help me with like end cap displays and in-store marketing and in-store advertising. So there's a whole world of that. It's the merchandising world, and it's a world that's still pretty opaque to most indies. They don't know how to get into that world. And for a savvy indie, if a publisher came to you with that kind of offer, be like, hey, we want to help with the paper book, and we'll do this bit in the bookstore, but we don't care about the ebook, and we'll give you a much bigger royalty. I imagine you'd be more willing to say yes to that, especially if you're able to keep your data dashboard. Although at this point, maybe you're pure indie the whole way.
Pretty much. And that's funny you mentioned ebooks. That reminds me of something that I was surprised about is I think we know we can sell our ebooks for, $3, $4, $5, but publishers want to sell paperback copies. And so they jack up the price of the ebook. So you're going to watch your ebook. If you enjoy ebook sales, say goodbye to them if you get a traditional publisher. And I don't know why they're not interested in ebook sales, but because they want to push the paperbacks, they're going to charge the same amount for ebooks as paperbacks, which really surprised me and made it a lot harder to get people to buy that, And the other thing I'd say, Thomas, is I talk to many traditionally published authors. I'll go to conferences and I'm dealing with people there who are speaking a lot. And I'll say, hey, I noticed you publish these books. I'll look them up on Amazon. And I'll say, why don't you tell me about that? And as we get to know each other better, I'll kind of hear about sales. And they're not selling a lot of copies. This one guy told me that once he publishes a book, there's a few hundred copies that go out, maybe 1,000, but the top 1% of books sell like 5,000 copies per year. I mean, there's not a whole lot of air up there. It's a very small minority that are selling that many copies. So if you can sell well as an indie, I mean, you've got something significant going on there. You don't want to lose that. But I think there's this belief like, oh, they've got a traditional publisher. That publisher must be selling their book for them. If they have a traditional publisher, they must be selling lots of copies and they must be very successful. I've talked to many traditionally published Christian authors, and they're not selling that many copies. Sometimes I'm almost surprised that publishers even give them contracts because of how few copies they end up selling as a result. So we shouldn't project ourselves on others, is my point, and just assume that because someone has a traditional publisher, they're out there selling thousands and thousands.
One of our most popular episodes of 2024 was Publishing Secrets Revealed at the Penguin Random House Trial. And one of the things that was revealed in that trial was that something like 20%, somewhere around 20% of traditionally published books from the big 5 publishers sell 12 copies or fewer. So
wow.
There's this view. I was like, oh, I'm with Penguin. I'm with HarperCollins. I am guaranteed to be a success. And that is not true. Many of these books are utter failures from a commercial perspective.
We know that there are box office bombs. We know that there are movies that studios put millions, hundreds of millions of dollars into that don't make back that much money. And I think we kind of look at that, we're like, I can't believe that happens. You know, how could all of these experts with all of this money put out a movie that then ends up bankrupting a studio? You know, we hear of those stories. Well, movies or studios, they're also kind of throwing stuff at the wall to see what sticks, right? Well, if you've got studios that are doing that with multi-million-dollar budgets, can you imagine how much publishers are doing that? So publishers are publishing, and they're surprised by 2 things. They're surprised when a book does poorly, but they're also surprised when a book does well. It's not a guarantee when they sign someone or give them a contract that that book's going to do well. And sometimes a book takes off, and no publisher sits back saying, yeah, we just knew that book was going to take off. They sit back pleasantly surprised that it sold thousands of copies. And they're equally surprised when a book falls flat. But again, it's like the studio. They're throwing stuff at the wall, trying to see what sticks and get some traction. But a lot of stuff doesn't. Although I didn't know that they would sell as few as 12 copies, like you just said. That's unbelievable.
So I want to talk a little bit about why traditional publishers price their ebooks so high. And for an example, as I'm recording this, Wind and Truth by Brandon Sanderson, which is 1,300 pages. You can get the hardback for $24, and you can get the Kindle ebook for $19.99. So the hardback is only $5 more than the ebook, and this is for a 1,300-page book. Okay, the book is like this thick on the shelf. Why? Part of it has to do with economies of scale. In order to make a profit selling a 1,300-page book, you have to print a lot of copies of that book, which means going to a printer in China and shipping them over on slow boat from China. And you have this massive number of copies in warehouses and retailers and distributors across the country. And you have to sell a certain number of those books in order to just break even. So if you're Tor and you've printed 1 million copies of these books, let's say you were able to get your cost per copy down to $2.50 or $3 a copy. So you're looking at an initial outlay of $3 million just to print the book. And every book you sell up into that 3 million point, you're still in the red. And so you really want to move those copies of those paper books in order to get the whole print run profitable. And every ebook that you sell that could have been a paperback or a hardback is one more hardback in the warehouse where you have to pay rent, right? Warehouse space is not free. Distributor space is not free. And so you're paying for storage space in all of these distribution warehouses around the country. And that is, it's very expensive, especially when you're talking about millions of copies of books. And so part of the reason is in economies of scale, they really want to drive readers towards the paperback or the hardback copies to make the whole print run profitable. So they're not stuck with hundreds of thousands of copies that they have to burn or pulp, which is often what will happen. So a publisher will print a whole bunch of copies of a book. They are not selling. And so then now they have to pay money to dispose of these books, which costs money. And so that's very real, very scary. And so one of the ways they fight that is by raising the cost of the ebook to make the paperback more appealing. The other reason why big publishers price their ebooks so high is that Amazon controls the ebook market. Amazon Kindle is the dominant ebook reader. The Amazon Kindle app is the dominant reader, even on other platforms. And the publishers are terrified that Amazon will get control over the market and control things like pricing and distribution and gobble up all of the money, which is a very real fear, right? Like one company controlling the market is very scary. And so what's happening is that Amazon is showering indie authors with billions of dollars. Just the Amazon KDP fund is, I think, $500 million a year that goes almost exclusively to indies. And that's just the Kindle lending library. That's not ebook sales. And most of the ebook sales are going to indies because, you could buy a $20 Brandon Sanderson book, or you could buy half a dozen lit RPGs or romanticises or whatever is your particular thing. And so there's this huge umbrella that's created this whole ecosystem for indie authors underneath that. And so Amazon is using indies as a lever against traditional bookstores and against the big publishing companies. And so as an indie author, you may think, oh, indie bookstores are my friend because we're both indie. That's not the case. Your financial incentives are actually completely misaligned. Indie bookstores make their money by selling best-selling authors from big publishers who are printing big rounds of paperback books and hardback books. And indie authors make their money selling ebooks on Amazon. And so you're actually at war, you just don't realize it. And the fact that you're independent doesn't make you friends. So for somebody who's trying to decide whether to go traditional or going indie, what advice would you have for that person?
I've done both, and I would encourage them to go indie. I think it's a wonderful world where you can. I'm also kind of a control freak, so maybe personality. I was talking to a friend of mine, I won't mention his name. He speaks frequently. One year he spoke 50-something times per year. I mean, he's speaking as much or more than I'm speaking as a pastor preaching to my church on Sunday. And he's bringing his suitcases with all of his books, putting them out at these conferences. And I said, hey, brother, you're making a lot of money for your publisher, aren't you? I said, how much are you making when you sell one of these books? And he told me, and I said, have you ever thought about self-publishing or indie publishing? Because you're working so hard to sell these books, but you're working hard for your publisher. And he said, I just don't want to deal with the headache. And I said, what headache? He said, I don't want to deal with a cover. I don't want to deal with an editor. I don't want to deal. And he is dealing with an editor because the editor sends the manuscript back and you go through. So there's still work that he's doing anyway. He says, I just want someone to publish it for me and do all this stuff. So if you're super busy or you've got a W-2, that takes 50 hours a week from you and you're involved in something else where you just don't have that investment of time or energy, I can see why traditional publishing might be better. I mean, if you've got some nonprofit ministry and that's your platform and you're traveling and you're speaking and doing these things, and so you just don't have the bandwidth to handle these things yourselves, traditional publishing can be an attractive route for you. But if you're an author, if you're a writer, this is your life, this is your livelihood, this is your passion, then I would highly encourage someone to be indie. And so for me, Thomas, I didn't become a writer by desire. I became a writer by profession. I just write out my sermons. If you would have asked me when I was in high school and college, I never would have thought that I was going to become an author. But I love studying God's word. I love putting sermons together. I love polishing, refining, improving. And I'm kind of a perfectionist. I'm hands-on. I'm a control freak. So I want to be over all these aspects. So it seems like I just described you, then you want to be indie. But the other thing, Thomas, is even asking someone, do you want to be indie or traditional? It's not that easy because it's very difficult to become traditional. How large is that pool of people who are just trying to get a response from a literary agent, who just want to get an email response from their query letter? And then even if you do get your literary agent, how large is that pool of people who are waiting to get a publisher, 2, 3, 4 years? And that's timeline. That's another thing. Even after I got my contract with Harvest House, it was like 2, 3 years before my books came out with them. So if you've got a book, do you want to have to wait 16, 18 months just before you see that book hit the shelves? Do you want to go through all of the proposal process with the literary agent and then them pitching it and the months of waiting for a publisher and then fitting your book into that publisher's timeline? So time is a very important factor that if you don't want to give that up, then I'd highly recommend indie.
Well said. Scott LaPierre, where can people find out more about you?
Yeah, thanks, Thomas. So my website, scottlapierre.org, my books, my speaking engagements, upcoming conferences, everything's listed there. Got a contact page if people want to reach out to me. And then the other thing is I've got a free book for your listeners that go to my website. It's called, I know you have a lot of Christian listeners, it's called 7 Biblical Insights for Christian Marriages. And that's a free book for anyone that comes to my website. And that's where kind of the hub where everything goes out from there to find everything else about me. And I know you'll have the link to that in the show notes, Thomas. So thanks for all you're doing for authors out there. And thanks for having me on the show. This is a blessing.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. And I will encourage you to check out his website. Scott has a great example of a well-done author website. So if you want to see what a good author website looks like, even if you're not interested in his books, go to scottlapierre.org. Special thanks to Jane Daly, author of Where Is My Sister? When Brianna vanishes inside an elite self-help program that demands total obedience, her sister Morgan must unravel a dangerous web of secrets before it's too late. Find out what happens next in the Christian psychological thriller Where Is My Sister by Jane Daly. Jane, thank you so much for being a patron of the podcast. Thank you for your support that helps keep this show on the air. And if you would like to become a patron, you can at novelmarketing.com/patron. The Novel Marketing Podcast is a production of authormedia.com. You can find the blog version of this episode along with links to everything we talked about today at authormedia.com/449. I'm Thomas Umstattd Jr. saying thank you for listening and live long and prosper.